Gender, huh? It's a real, it's a real powder keg these days, right?
Absolutely, sparks flying everywhere. And today we're digging into one of those sparks, one that's causing a huge uproar.
President Trump's executive order. I mean, if
Uh-huh.
you've been tuning into shows like Think Politics,
Mm.
this is like the hottest of hot button issues.
No doubt about that. It's way more than just a minor policy shift. We're talking seismic. February 5th, 2025, mark the date, the order dropped, and the title says it all. Keeping men out of women's sports. We've been poring over, these excerpts, really trying to get to the heart of it all.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's like the bottom line? What actually changes with this order?
Essentially, it bars transgender women and girls from competing in female sports. We're talking any public school or institution that gets, federal funding, from your local little league all the way up to like big time college athletics. Yeah, and the way they do it is pretty straightforward. They're basically saying Title IX's, the one about no sex-based discrimination in education, well, they're interpreting it to explicitly exclude trans athletes. They're using biological sex assigned at birth as like the deciding factor.
So how do they actually make sure everyone follows this? What are the consequences?
Money talks, right. They can pull federal funding. Schools that don't comply are risking like some serious financial hits.
Makes sense.
And to really drive it home, the order says both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education have to enforce it. The Education Department even has to come up with a whole plan within 90 days for withholding those funds. Oh, and it goes even further. They're looking at visas for foreign athletes, and they even want the State Department to lean on international groups like the IOC. Think 2028 Olympics in LA.
So they're like going global with this. This isn't just some domestic policy. They're really aiming to set a precedent. But why? Why are they so adamant about this? What's their reasoning?
The big word is fairness. The whole administration, they're all on about how trans women, especially those who went through male puberty, have, these inherent physical advantages like more muscle mass, height. They're saying it creates an uneven playing field and hurts cisgender female athletes,
Yeah.
women whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth.
And there's that quote, right, the Trump statement that really sums it up. With this executive order, the war on women's sports is over. It's like a victory cry, framing this as a corrective measure.
Exactly. They're not painting this as discriminatory, but as a necessary step to even the playing field. But it goes deeper, too. There was another order, January 21st this year, that was all about recognizing only two sexes, male and female, set in stone based on like biological stuff at conception. So the sports ban, it's all coming from that same fundamental view.
So it's not just about sports. It's about a whole philosophy of gender. And it sounds like this was a major part of his 2024 campaign platform.
100%. This was a campaign promise. And delivering on it is definitely playing well with a certain part of the public. The sources we looked at, there was polling data showing over half of those asked felt like trans rights had gone too far. And that fits with what we've been seeing, right? Over 24 states have similar bans at the state level. And even the NCAA has had rules since 2022 saying trans women have to do a year of testosterone suppression before they can compete.
Right, right. It's all connected.
Absolutely. This executive order, it's not an isolated thing. It's part of a much bigger trend, something our sources call the war on gender. Heavy stuff.
Definitely. So unpack that a little bit. What's this war on gender all about?
It's this global pushback, basically. It's against what they call gender ideology. And by that, they mean the whole idea of like recognizing trans and non-binary identities as, legitimate.
So they see this ban as a key battleground in this bigger ideological war.
Exactly. And it's not the only front either. It goes hand in hand with like restrictions on trans people in the military and roadblocks to getting gender affirming medical care. The big picture. It seems like they're trying to reinforce traditional gender roles, the ones based purely on the sex you're assigned at birth. And get this, it's international. The Trump administration is like cozying up to conservative groups in Europe, Latin America. They even want to sway those big international sports organizations to get on board.
Yeah, there's a lot of heated rhetoric being thrown around in this whole debate. Trump even said something about getting transgender insanity the hell out of our schools.
Yeah.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, that's pretty much the tone of this whole clash.
Yeah.
And it's not just the words, right? They announced this order on, get this, National Girls and Women in Sports Day. Even the title of the order itself, it all feeds into the narrative they're pushing.
Okay, but let's step back and think about the trans athletes themselves, the ones directly affected by this ban. what are the real-world consequences for them?
Well, this is where it gets really personal, right? Being excluded from teams, it can really hurt their mental health. It can make them feel like they don't belong, in their own school community. And playing sports, for a lot of young people, it's a huge part of growing up, of like finding your place.
Yeah. And I'm sure transgender rights groups are, well, they're not staying silent about this.
Definitely not. GLA, for example, they're accusing the administration of hiding behind the whole "we're protecting women's sports" thing. They say the real agenda is like chipping away at trans rights. And they're bringing up how some of the people pushing this ban, how they used to stand on women's rights issues. Kind of makes you question, right? And then you have Athlete Ally. They're heartbroken, you can tell. They're talking about trans youth losing the chance to experience the joy of sports,
Yeah.
of playing as their true selves. They say it's just like a simplistic, harmful solution to a really complex issue. And, the sources we looked at also bring up the science, or, well, the lack of it in some ways. There was this review in Sports Medicine back in 2017, and they basically said there's not much solid proof that trans women have some huge advantage, even after hormone therapy. So it makes you wonder about, like, the real basis for this whole ban. And the Human Rights Campaign, they're worried about a ripple effect, like this will just embolden people to discriminate and harass trans students even more.
Let's talk about the legal side of things. This executive order, it's heading straight for a legal battle, right?
Oh, yeah. Lawsuits are a guarantee. People are going to argue that this ban violates the whole equal protection thing in the Constitution, and they'll say it's twisting Title IX to fit an agenda. It's a total 880 from how the Biden administration was doing things, way more inclusive. And now schools are stuck in the middle. No matter what they do, they could end up in court. And you know how it goes. The schools with more money, they'll have an easier time fighting it out. So that could make things even more unequal. And sadly, there are already reports that trans students are being harassed more, like the climate at school is getting worse.
So this might not stop at the lower courts. It could go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. It's touching on some really fundamental legal questions, and different courts are interpreting the laws in different ways. Yeah, it could definitely end up in front of the Supreme Court. And the states, they're all over the place. You have Maine, for example. Republican lawmakers that are like, follow this order to the letter. But then you have California, they're thinking about suing. And even the NCAA, they're having a look at their own rules because of this whole thing. Their president, Charlie Baker, even said they might need to make changes. And there are these conservative legal groups like America First Legal, and they're filing Title IX complaints left and right. It's a mess, honestly.
So this was obviously a major issue in the 2024 election. How did it play out in the public and political spheres?
Well, it was front and center, that's for sure. Republican campaigns, they poured tons of money into ads about this, trying to rile up their base and appeal to anyone worried about fairness in sports. And like we talked about earlier, those polls show a lot of people do support restricting trans athletes. But that just goes to show how divided things are. You have states like Washington with laws that protect against discrimination based on gender identity. Total opposite of what these bans are trying to do.
And Trump's, well, let's call it colorful language, probably had an impact on voters too.
No question. His whole way of talking about trans issues, it resonated with some people, for sure. But on the flip side, you have critics who are really worried about the impact on trans people's mental and physical health. The World Health Organization, they even put out warnings about violence and stigma against people with different gender identities. At the end of the day, it just highlights how divisive this issue is. People have deeply held beliefs on both sides, and finding any kind of middle ground is super hard. Making decisions in this area, it means trying to balance fairness, inclusion, and people's sense of self,
Yeah.
It's tough.
So let's wrap this up. We've gone deep on President Trump's executive order banning transgender women from competing in women's sports at schools that get federal funding. We've looked at the reasons behind it, the whole war on gender context, what it means for trans athletes, the legal fights that are brewing, and the reactions from the public and politicians. It's definitely complicated, and there are no easy answers.
Nope, not at all. It forces us to think hard about some really big questions, identity, biology, what it means to be fair, how we include people in society.
Totally. And here's something to chew on after all of this. If we value both fairness and inclusion, how do we handle these situations where deeply held beliefs about identity and biology clash? What will the long-term effects of policies like this be? Not just for the athletes themselves, but for how we understand gender and identity going forward. It really makes you think.
It sure does.